content resolvers and content providers. Now, what can we access through the calendar provider? So we can attend for an event. We can look at the attendees. We can schedule and read the alerts that have been set. We can access the individual calendars as well as events that occur under each calendar. We can also look at the reminders that have been set, because you can set multiple reminders for any single event. Right now, Android provides pretty much a smooth integration with most of the services offered by Google. So Gtalk, Gmail, your address book, and well, the calendar isn't so smooth, right? And it really has proved to be one of the trickiest services for integration, and that's primarily because of certain changes that have been happening in the background. Right now, they provide an API, the web-based API for accessing your calendar data, and you can actually find all the information on the link provided. And it can be used from Android apps, but like I said, it's web-based, and it's really going to require that you have a data connection in order to access your calendars. And really and truly, it's not working with the information that's already on the device, because if you think about it, your calendar syncs with whatever Google Calendar you have out there, or even your Facebook calendars and stuff. So it's not really integrating with the data that's already on your phone. I mean, why go out on the net for this information if you already have it on the device? Right? So the question is, why is there no official calendar provider? And the answer to this question is that there actually is a calendar provider, right? But Google has chosen not to make this public. So in order to access the official calendar provider, which is what is used by the calendar app that's on the device, to really access it, and a good example of this is done, well, it's not here, it's done by Jim Blackler, right? What he does is that he actually takes the source, the actual Android source, and he removes the @hide annotation from the provider classes for the calendar and rebuilds his SDK. And to compile apps that use this calendar provider, he simply builds his applications against this custom SDK. Right, so you can actually access a calendar provider, it's just that it's going to require you going into the source. Fortunately, however, you don't have to use the SDK classes to get the data. You can actually get it using a regular content provider and content resolver. Because all the data is exposed across applications, and really what you need is to have the necessary permissions to access this information, right? So to read data from the calendar tables or the underlying calendar data store, you need to ensure that your application has the android.permission.readCalendar permission set. And if you're going to make any modifications, you need to have the android.permission.writeCalendar included in your manifest file. Right now, this would allow a user to query the data using the standard SDK, obviously not with the formalized calendar provider, but of course using the data that's stored on the device itself. Now, the internal calendar API they haven't been published, and they haven't been published for a reason. And this is pretty much due to the fact that the underlying data, both in how they're stored and the content URIs, are changing between Android frameworks. And if it's made public, then what it means is that it ties Google to a specific format, a specific setup. And at the moment, I guess they're just not at the stage where they want to do that. And one such example is that in framework, the Android framework 2.1 and before, you would actually have a different URI for accessing the calendar information, as opposed to from 2.2 upwards, you have a different URI. Right now, in developing applications that use the calendar provider, the emulator doesn't have Google services installed, so you can't test this against the emulator. You have to test on an actual device that has the Google services installed. So to access the calendars, right, now pre 2.2, pre-Froyo, you could just query the URI content calendar calendars, and you just use a content resolver to enumerate the available calendars on the device. There's also the content calendar events, which would list the corresponding events. Now, as of Android 2.2, this URI is now contentandroid.com.calendar/calendars, and the events are actually in contentandroid.com/calendar/instances/when. So the calendar table, there are quite a few tables that pretty much fall under the calendar provider. One such is the calendars table. And these are just a few of the actual columns, the fields that can be accessed and set in the calendar table. So as with all tables in SQLite, you have the ID column. You have an access level, which pretty much specifies what level of access the user has to the calendar. So you can be the administrator, you could just have read-only rights, and so on. You have the selected table, which on the device itself, you can select whether or not you want a calendar to be displayed or the events from that calendar to be displayed. That column controls that. You can set the time zone of the events. You can specify if the calendar should be synced or not. You can read the sync state, whether, when last it's been synced or if there's a failure or whatever. And an account to which the calendar is tied. So it uses that account to actually do syncs. And this is primarily important because, like I said, you can sync calendars across like Facebook, Google. You have various sources for calendars. Now, more information about the various columns and in the tables and the individual tables can be found at the link provided here. That's the actual calendar.java file from the Android source, and pretty much that's where you'll find most, if not all, the documentation because it's not really well documented. So a partial data model of the calendar table, you have an ID, a title, an access level. I think that's root. Yeah, I think that's root access level, whether or not it's selected. The time zone, it's set to be synced and a sync state and a sync account, right? So accessing a calendar, given the calendar ID, you're now able to obtain the events, reminders, and other information related to the calendar. And all dates in the calendar are stored in the UTC format, and that just pretty much means it's represented as the number of milliseconds that have elapsed since midnight, January 1st, 1970, and the event time in Greenwich, UK. Not sure what happens for dates before January 1st, 1970. Haven't tried it. So these are some of the important URIs. Like I said, for the calendar table, it's com.android.calendar/calendars. All right, now you have multiple URIs for events, right? So the lower one, we definitely know works on 2.2, being the content com.android.calendar/instances, and if you're doing a query /when, that definitely works in 2.2, and that's really what we've tested against. Supposedly for 2.1 and before, the URI that's above is where you'll find your events, and it should also carry through to 2.2, but we haven't tested against the events. So Martin's just going to walk you through, the steps in setting up a simple calendar list activity.
So in the code that we're going to show right now, we try to make it as simple as possible, showing the things that are at least the base code that is necessary to get like a calendar list to show with the calendars that you have on your device. So what we did was we just queried the calendar, and in a list view, we just want to show all of the calendars on the device. And we have a new calendar field at the bottom, but I'll get back to that later. So once you click on one of the calendars, you want it to take you to another list view that would show you events for the selected calendar. So it will take you to this view, and it will show you the events for the selected calendar. So if I go back, here I would have selected coursework, and it will show me these events. It doesn't list the time for the events. Just try to keep it as simple as possible for demonstration purposes. It doesn't list the time of the events, but those are actual upcoming events in the calendar. So we start off with some local fields. Here we have the string that we're going to parse for the URI. We get it in URI format, and then we specify which columns we want to use. We're just going to query the ID and the title fields. So we have the unique ID for the selected calendar and the actual title of the calendar. So we want to show each calendar item in a list view, so we need a list view and an array adapter for the list view. And so when the user clicks on one of the calendars, we just have a mapping from ID of the calendar to the title of the calendar. So we're going to store the IDs separately, and then we're going to also store a mapping of IDs to titles, to the title of the calendar. And then this edit text, which I promise I'll get back to in a second. So then for the onCreate method, we just have a simple method that, since we probably want to refresh the list every now and then, we just have a refresh method that's being called. Could attach it to a button if you wanted to, but whenever we hit the button, it will refresh the list view in case you added a new calendar or removed any calendars or anything like that. So the meat of the code is in the refresh method, and that's what we're going to spend most of the time right now. So we're going to create a cursor so that we can iterate through the events in the calendar, whichever calendar the user selects. So we get the content result and we query based on the URI that we passed earlier. And we're just going to specify that we want to return the IDs and the titles. So from the partial list, we just want to return these. And we start the managing cursor so that when the activity ends, that the cursor wouldn't take up any resources either. And then this part of the code is just basic stuff that you already know, just some initializations. So at this point, we made some initialization and we actually executed the query. And now we want to iterate through the results in the cursor. So we just have the try catch there in case the cursor is null or anything. And the actual ID of the next result, it's the first field, and the title is the second field. So we do get string on the offset 0 and 1 for the ID and the title respectively. And then we add those to the string of IDs that we have and the mapping of calendar IDs to titles that we have. So next we want to attach the actual titles of the calendars to the list view. So the last part of the refresh method. So at this point we already made the necessary initializations and we've executed the actual query. And we've iterated through the results and we've gotten each calendar ID and each calendar title. So we set the calendar adapter. So here we're just mapping the IDs and the titles of the calendar so that when the user clicks on the calendar that we can use the position that was clicked to return the actual ID of the calendar that was selected. So once it's clicked, then we want to start the activity that displays the events for the selected calendar. So we just set up an on-click listener, and we just start to create a new intent, specify the new class. So right now we're in the calendar list activity class, and then we're going to launch the calendar event list activity class. So we put the ID in a bundle so that when the event list activity starts, it knows which calendar was selected and which one it's going to use. Okay, so the reason I have the edit text down there is that I actually tried to add a calendar. And from the data model that we looked at, we see that there are a lot of fields associated with the calendar itself. The easiest ones to figure out are ID and title. The rest of the fields, they have some descriptions of what they are, but we're not 100% sure of what they are. So what I did, I just tried to add a calendar with just a title. And the title that it shows was Moose, just a random word that came to my head. And yeah, so I didn't specify the ID field because I'm pretty sure it's auto-generated. And because right now if I click on the Moose calendar, it returns ID 21. So I know that the ID is auto-generated. So all I specified when I added to the calendar, when I added a new calendar to the database was the title. So right now I actually can't get rid of the Moose. Right now in my phone there's a calendar called Moose that I can't get rid of programmatically. I tried a few things already, and sometimes I get some exceptions, and I tried deleting it and it just wouldn't delete for some reason. So I'm still working on that, but I have a Moose in my calendar. And every now and then I get a force close because since I only specified the title field, there's a lot of sync fields associated with it. Like there are at least
Yeah,
4 or
the
5
default
sync.
setting for the sync event is actually 1, which sets it to sync. And if there's no sync account, it has nothing to sync against, so it's going to run into some issues.
Yeah, so right now, if sometimes, so when it's trying to, you see it doing the background syncing, and then it might give me a force close error. And actually, if I try to view in the standard calendar application, if I go in there and try to view my calendars, I won't be able to. It's just going to force close and kick me out. So I'm still working on that. Leon is going to walk you through the calendar event list activity code.
All right, so I'm just pretty much going to be working from Eclipse. All right, so the idea behind the calendar event list activity is pretty much the same as the calendar activity. We just query events associated with a particular calendar, and we pull up that information and display it to the user. Again, I think we only do the title and we have the ID. I mean, the information is there, but for the sake of simplicity, I guess we just display the title of the event. So you can ignore the bad programming practice of using a static date and stuff like that. That's not really important. What you'll notice is that for our URI, we have a string, right? So we have the content.com.android.calendar/instances/when. So whenever you're doing a query against the events, you're going to use this URI. And it's typically in, I think, 1 of 3 formats, or you can have multiple formats. But for our purposes, if we leave it as the default, it's just going to give us all the events on the device. We can also specify a date range, and I think in this case we also specify a calendar ID. So we have an array adapter for the purposes of when we're actually binding to our list view. We have a list of strings, which we call SIDs, and in this we just store the the event ID.
Yes, I'm mapping.
Right, and we have a mapping from the event ID to the event title or display name. This is the actual list view that we use, and I don't think we use this edit text. I think it was brought across from the other activity. Right, so we use two date picker dialogs to actually allow the user to select date range, and we just associate it with our local variables that we've created. Now in onCreate, we do our usual stuff. We call the parent classes super, so we call super.onCreate, set up our content view, which is just a simple view with a list and two calendar dialogues and not much. It's a simple XML layout. And then we specify a default time, so we use the current time as our starting time, and we've chosen to pull just the next 7 days of events by default. And after that, we make a call. So after setting up all our buttons and setting up all the UI elements, we call the refresh function. So I'll ignore most of this stuff because it's just fat. I mean, the important part is really in refresh. Right, so we build our URI from the calendar event location, which again, as I showed you before, is just com.android.calendar/instances/when. And, well, we actually don't use that. So we have a start date, which we get from the date picker dialog, and we have an end date from the date picker dialog as well. So we use this when we're actually selecting the range of dates or the range of events to display. Right? So we include in our query, all right, so in the builder we add the start date, we add the end date. So it's actually appending to the original URI. And we specify in the query for our cursor, we specify that the calendar ID should be equal to the particular calendar that we're looking for events from. So, right, so this is based on the calendar that was selected on the previous screen. Once we do that, we open our cursor, and we pretty much iterate through all the entries that we've received from actually executing the query and just adding them to our map and our list of strings. Once we've done that, we pretty much just use an array adapter and do a set adapter on the list view and display this to the user. Now, I don't think this is only required once. For the underlying changes, once a change happens in the adapter itself, we could just use the notify dataset changed to actually allow the array adapter to notify the view that's using its data that the underlying data set has changed, and it will cause itself to refresh. So this is kind of redundant. We don't really need it here, but we'll just have it there. Once this is done, it pretty much updates the UI and lists all the events that occur on that calendar, in that calendar, within the specified date range. Martin will show you an example of that.
Okay, so here's the calendar list activity. Checking our coursework, we're taken to the next activity, which shows that I'm supposed to have computer vision, database systems, and mobile mobile programming within the next week. Now, if I only choose for today, choose a date range for today, should show me, so it's supposed to have database system before mobile programming and also mobile programming. Let me see if I can go back to last year. So last year I had AUP, had to go to some office hours, get some help in all these courses. But that's pretty much it. It just allows you to specify a starting range and an ending range to search for the events. And if I go back and go all the way down here, you see little moves I can't get rid of. But that's pretty much a simple example of using the calendar provider.
All right, so we'll now hand off to Marilla and Jeff, and they'll look at the contact provider.
I got a question about the calendar.
Sure.
At the beginning, I think you mentioned like attendees, or you can get like a list of people involved with your events.
Yeah, so you pretty much have access to all that information. Attendees, you have access to like the location, everything that you could pretty much access from your Google Calendar, you can access there.
So that thing kind of works like a cache, like bringing together all the calendars.
Yeah, so when you sync, it just pulls everything to its local data store, and it has it there. So it cleans it out, I think, once the event has passed and all the reminders have fired off, it will actually go through and clean it out.
You can't get past events.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Because as you saw, Martin, right, so it's kind of dependent on, I guess, the space that's available.
And one more thing, can you like send an intent to it to tell it to explicitly update, like?
To the underlying data provider?
Yeah, it's like the whatever syncs.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think you probably could force it to sync, but I think that would be just a regular device sync as opposed to sending it to the calendar directly.